Now we are to our next speaker, who is a speaker before we have a 1 hour lunch break. Ornit Shinar is head of venture investing at City Israel. Her focus of interest includes fintech, cybersecurity, and digitization. In addition to this, she is a member of the advisory board of Copenhagen Fintech and the founder of Yazamiyot, Israel's leading women's entrepreneur network. The title of Ornit's talk is From Fintech to Tech for Fin. And of course, just to remind you that on the Masters in Robots website, you can get the full biographies of every speaker. So Ornit, very warm welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be in Poland again. I was there about 18 months ago. And at the time I flew in and I forgot to bring my voice with me. So now it's kind of...
I remember because I was at this meeting.
It was terrible. So at least this time I'm not physically with you, but my voice is around and you'll be able to hear me effortlessly. And that's a good start. I was asked to talk today about fintech and innovation. And I think, first of all, I'm happy to talk about that. And I'm going to pepper it a little bit with personal experiences and and what's happening in the world right now. I think we cannot talk about current fintech and not consider the effects of COVID on the world. So as mentioned, I run external innovation and venture investing, so it includes both investments but also business development, working with startups and large companies and trying to understand how we can integrate them into City, how we can make best use of them, but also how we can introduce them to our clients, show thought leadership, and ensure that they too have the best technologies at their fingertips and possibly even do co-developments together with them so that we can best engage and create the strongest solutions for everyone. Another word I will say is that I'm a lawyer by education. I started out shortly after working as a lawyer in high tech, working in sales, marketing, business development. And surely enough, being in Israel, I moved to being an entrepreneur. I founded a number of companies. And after that, I got to fintech in 2013. And in fact, I was brought in to set up this program of working with external innovation, with startups from on the outside. So in the current times, we also understand that we're a holistic people. We're not just who we are at work. So I will add that I'm the mother of 5 children. I have a dog, which in these current times is the best excuse to be able to go for a walk when everything is shut down. And that, you know, when we're looking at work and employees today in the current atmosphere, then all of that is part and parcel of who we are and how we work and how as an employer we need to offer, or by the way, as a bank that needs to service its clients, how we need to offer the best platform and the best environment possible for all our employees. And I'll be happy to talk one day about what we did in that space, because I think City has really been amazing in that space. It's really a point of pride for us. In 2012, City opened an innovation lab in Israel, and that lab was supposed to recruit the top talents in Israel in areas of AI, of mobile technologies, and so on and so forth. And very quickly, it found out that it had a few problems. First of all, people didn't know what working in a bank meant. They thought maybe someone forgot their password and they're going to have to be tech support, and that's not what they went and became genius technologists for. And so there was a gap in knowledge and understanding as to what one develops, when one does, when one works as a technologist in a bank. The second thing is that today we all know what fintech is, but at the time, nobody really knew what that was. So there was a gap in acknowledgement or understanding as to what this is and whether it's an exciting opportunity. And the third thing was that City isn't a retail bank in Israel. So I know that when you walk around in Poland, you see City handlovi everywhere, and it feels like it's a known thing. In Israel, we didn't have that. We were a small, or not even small, we were just an entity that serviced large companies, but your average techie had never necessarily seen or heard of City. So we had that as our third challenge. And due to my background in technology and startups, People thought that I was the perfect fit for the job, and I was asked to apply for the position. And the reality of it was that it was an interesting choice because I had no clue what fintech was. And I was a little worried about that. So I decided as a first step to go to Google and find out what fintech was. And there were very, very few hits on Google. And when I had the gall to even add Israel into this, then the number of hits decreased even further. There were only 4 hits that mentioned fintech and Israel, not 4 pages, 4 hits, that's it. So in a moment of youthful arrogance, I would say, I decided that if Google doesn't know, it's kind of okay that I don't know either, and I will figure it all out as I go. So in the first few months at Citi, any person I would talk to would ask me, what is fintech? And in truth, within a few months, every person I spoke to said, I'm an angel investor in fintech. So very naturally, I would say, well, what did you invest in? And people would tell me, well, I haven't invested in anything yet. I intend to, I'm really interested, but there were no actual investments that had been done yet. Within a few months after that, there were VC investments, there were angel investments, there were more and more companies, and this had all started to become a reality. And this is maybe my first insight that I would like to share with you, that if you dream of something and you think of something, and you start talking about that something, if you start believing in it, slowly but surely, it becomes a reality. So going back to the early days, I went in search of fintech startups. I was supposed to create a program for them. And there were only about 30 or 40 companies in Israel. And of those companies, there were a few larger ones like Payoneer and Super Derivatives, that today the former is a unicorn and the latter has been acquired for over $350 million. But the others, there were a lot of companies that were, I like to call them, I went to the bank, I stood in line. It was really annoying to stand in line. So I invented something to resolve problem X, and you can fill the gap on what problem X is. An example is, cashing checks remotely or stuff like that. And there were many companies that had small solutions that, maybe resolved a slight ache, but weren't really strategic or exciting for a large financial institution. So we spent months and months bringing speakers, opening up, sharing our thoughts, sharing our pains, so that people would start to understand what is really strategic, what is really painful, because our first and foremost goal was to create an ecosystem. And we really wanted to support the Israeli government in its effort to do so. And it was critical for us to ensure that not only do we do it for the ecosystem, but that we also see true value out of it, right? So we see companies that we really believe have a lot to contribute to society and to Citi in particular. So the important thing to note is that in 2015, everyone knew what fintech was. Everyone, not just in fintech, everyone globally. And so I think if you look at it from that perspective, it gives you a good point of reference that in 2 years you can create something from scratch. And it's not an Israeli thing or a foreign thing or a globe. Everyone in the globe knew what it was because of many parallel efforts that had been done all over the place. And they'd be done, I want to say that, for those 2 years, we were walking in the desert, to use an Israeli image. And we weren't walking alone. We were cooperating with anyone who was willing to walk a mile with us, right? So we had other banks and entrepreneurs and just 2 people and an idea. And of course, all the investors, big and small, who were willing to look at it. We were willing to talk to them, to tell them what we think, to share with them companies we were meeting, anything to just get this jump started. So I'm proud to say that today our accelerator has hosted companies from around the globe, and we have over 90 graduates that have raised over $1 billion US. So this has become a very concrete reality in the sheer numbers of it. Some of these companies are in and of themselves worth, close to $1 billion per company. So a very big success. And if I look at Israel from their perspective, so Israel has become a real power play in fintech. And this has also been done through time and efforts. And if you look at it, then there are areas today that if you want to deal in those spaces, you cannot avoid the Israeli fintech ecosystem. And I'll give you a few examples of that. Chargeback guarantee is a great example where if you look at it, you have companies like Riskified, like Forter, that are all coming out of Israel, and they're the leaders in this space. And do I think it's a coincidence that the two of the 3 or 4 top leaders are Israeli? I don't. And I think it came out of a number of things. In this specific case, the founders of these companies, and by the way, also of the top US company in the space, are all people that worked in PayPal. PayPal acquired a company, an Israeli startup called Fraud Sciences. And the people that moved from Fraud Sciences to work in PayPal then went on to sharpen their tools and develop an understanding of what the market needs. And as they left PayPal, they went on to develop 3 startups in the space, all of them competing head to head, and all of them today leading the charge in this space. If you look at another area where Israel has become a big leader in fintech, it's in SMB lending. So SMB lending traditionally was an area that was underserved. It's very difficult and costly to underwrite a company, and if you can underwrite a large company, it's more efficient from the financial institution's perspective than it is to do so for SMBs. And so typically they got lesser service than did the large enterprises. And startups realized that there was an opportunity gap, and that focusing on what the SMBs would need would be very beneficial for them. So in that space, you have companies like Bluevine, Fundbox, Behalf. They're some of the largest players in the space, and they're also all Israeli companies. If you think of another industry, and we'll talk about, I don't know, shoes, if we look at what I like, or even lighting, right? You'll often see that stores all congregate to a specific street or specific neighborhood, and they're not, it feels not, inefficient from a competitive point of view, but they still do tend to all go to the same area. And the reality of it is that in fintech and in high tech in general, we've seen the same thing happen. So you have talents that come work in a company. As they leave the company, they've developed certain talents, certain understandings, and they go and develop a company that is not exactly competing with the first one, but is in a general area that is similar. And in that way, we create clusters of companies that tend to all be in specific areas. So this is not all that has changed in the last 7 years. Internally, we've grown to also better understand what fintech actually is. So if you'd asked me in 2013, what is fintech? My perception of it would have been a very narrow understanding of, for instance, things to do with ATMs and payments and capital markets, and very, very narrowly defined. And in fact, over these years, I think financial institutions have also grown to understand that their needs are far, far greater than just those typical areas that we have discussed. So it includes cybersecurity, enterprise IT, customer experience, but also things like deep tech, like artificial intelligence and machine learning, which are definitely critical. And as Nicholas Davis mentioned earlier today, they bring a lot of value with them, but they also require a lot of attention as they bring new challenges with them. And I think we've all read about cases where husband and wife both apply for credit on the same bank account and they don't get the same response. And nobody wants that, but technology has made that happen based on preconceived ideas from the past, and we have to make sure that we prevent that from continuing and reiterating itself. But if I go back to where fintech is today, we've also grown to see that it itself has grown, and it's split into many subcategories. So you have fintech for banking, but you also have it in insurtech for insurance companies and regtech. And to some extent, I would say that legal tech is a very part and parcel of this space, with many underlying similarities that require the same interest. And maybe I'll even add a little anecdotal statistic. If you look at financial institutions pre-2013, before there was fintech, they still made up over 25% of purchasing in technology, meaning financial institutions always acquired a lot of technology, but until you called it fintech, it was just them acquiring a lot of technology, and now it's something that is far better defined and understood. So this growth in understanding has grown to other areas as well. So for instance, I think people today look at things like prop tech, so real estate and property technology. And it's understood that that is very relevant to financial institutions, because if you buy a house, you need a mortgage. Maybe we can do things better for you. If you want to, for instance, buy a house in a different way, find different ways of financing it. Maybe you can do it through the capital markets and see, we've seen technologies develop in that space, and so on and so forth. And this is perhaps a first hint as to why I call this tech is, and understand that what we're actually looking at is a lot of technologies for financial institutions, not necessarily fintech. And this too has been a critical element in the growth of the Israeli tech ecosystem. If you look at cybersecurity, enterprise IT, and deep tech, these are areas where Israel has been very strong traditionally. In fact, the previous speaker mentioned it, and I think you cannot do anything in cybersecurity without looking at an Israeli company from one direction or another. So in 2017, armed with the success of the City Accelerator, we convinced the mothership, the large company, to open up venture investing activities in Israel as well. And I'm very, very happy to say that we recently closed our 9th investment. We invest in companies of all stages, from early stage to growth to pre-IPO. And we've really been doing it in a variety of areas, from all of the areas that we mentioned above. And we are very, very keen on meeting more companies, so you can always feel free to reach out. But I wanted to also discuss this fintech innovation thing. Has it been unique to Israel? So yes and no. Certainly Israel has gained the moniker of startup nation, and we have been very good at developing and growing and getting from no activity in a space to a very vast activity. In fact, if you remember, I mentioned 25% of acquisitions were done by banks for technology. And in Israel, that number stood on 4% only. So the fact that we have become a recognized entity in fintech is a very large, very big achievement, certainly. But Israel has not been an exception. In fact, I want to say that this decade has been the decade of fintech. And it's grown around the globe. If you can look at it in the US, you can look at it in Europe, in Asia. It's certainly been something that has changed profoundly. And one of those changes has been, I would say, in the fact that we view fintech no longer as I have to go to the bank to do X, but often the financial aspect of the things has been integrated into the very core of the technology. If you want to order a cab now, you will press a button and the payment is just part and parcel of the deal. It is not something that you need to separate out. And that change has shifted a lot in this space and has enabled us to rethink a lot of services from where they were to where they are now. And you'll see that very often we'll try and see where we can meet with the client in the place where they're already doing their activity, instead of requiring them to come to us to do an activity of one type or another. So in my case, in addition, if you think about what Yuval Noah Harari mentioned this morning, he was talking about how cooperation between the different governments in the context of COVID would enable us to be much bigger and stronger in the face of this pandemic. And he wished that there would be more talking and more cooperation. In fact, he even said that our big advantage over the virus is that it cannot talk to each other around different countries and improve itself, whereas we can. So one of the big advantages of Citi is that we are a very multinational company with locations in over 100 countries. In fact, from the venture investing point of view, we have offices in San Francisco, New York, London, Singapore, and of course, Tel Aviv. But in my case, I've been doing a lot of traveling, even well beyond that. So we mentioned Poland, but many, many other countries, and going to talk to other tech hubs and financial institutions around the world has been critical for me. In addition to that, I sit on the board of Copenhagen FinTech, and that has given me a very good insight into what's happening in the Nordics as well. So armed with all of that, I want to mention a few things. So if you look at Scandinavia, I would say that, and I'll focus on Denmark for this, that Denmark was starting out with a less developed VC ecosystem than what you find in Israel, and with smaller companies that had raised less money and were still at an early stage. So in my first visit, my first surprise was that those companies were all looking at the large players in Denmark and trying to focus on selling to them, and then as a second step, going to the rest of the Nordics. And then typically they would go to Germany and Poland as their next step after that. And that would take them years and years. And that is a very big contrast to what we were seeing in Israel, where the Israeli startup would first of all go to the US, at a pinch it would go to Europe, and only then maybe go to Israel. If it was going to go to Israel first, what it would do is just do one single POC in Israel, quick and dirty, and then run off to the rest of the world, just to prove that they have something that actually works. And so this was a major, major change. And in the 2.5, 3 years that I've been visiting there, this has changed quite dramatically in Scandinavia as well, where you see that there is now an understanding, and it's not perfect and it still needs to grow and it's not across the board, but there is a real understanding that you need to focus first and foremost on global problems and global solutions. And I think they still have some challenges. And ironically, I think the biggest challenge comes from having very good technologies, very strong platforms locally that make it exciting. So if you take, for instance, Bank ID, I don't know if you know this, but Bank ID is a local solution that enables you to identify yourself digitally in everything, right? In shops, in government offices, in banks. And it's very exciting to develop things around it. And they've developed amazing solutions that really are extremely original and interesting and innovative. However, one has to wonder whether those solutions will then be exportable to other countries that don't have Bank ID, and whether that will turn them into startups with a real growth potential, or into nice companies that will maybe fund them, maybe do well for themselves, but will not be your next unicorn. In Poland, we've seen that there have been many very interesting efforts that have been done. We've seen a lot of work being done in artificial intelligence and biometrics, and we know that a lot of other strong digital efforts have been done across the country, even historically in telecoms, not just in fintech. And in that sense, I think it's also quite interesting and exciting. I think it also remains to be seen how well this will get exported around the world, or how promptly it will get exported from Poland to other countries. So if you look at what we were mentioning in terms of concentration with regards to Israel, I think one of the interesting things that I've noted is that the same thing happens elsewhere in the world as well. It's not a unique Israeli thing, it's a techie or maybe just a global thing. So in that sense, if you look at it in Scandinavia, so in Norway, you have a lot of technology around shipping, you have a lot of technology around trade, and in general, in the Scandinavian countries, you have a lot of technology around APIs and around sustainability that has become very trendy, I want to say, in the last 12 months, but where you see a lot more activity happening around that there than I would see in Israel, for instance. Not to say that there is none, just a bigger focus. So if we talk about COVID-19, and I think it's the elephant in the room, how can we ignore it? So COVID-19 has affected fintech, obviously, just like it has affected everyone else. I think initially you saw that the banks had to, first and foremost, make sure that the lights were on, right? That everyone had a way to work from home, had remote access, had the ability to best service our clients and ensure that our employees are safe. And this is not a small feat. If you take an example of a company like Citi, overnight, we needed to ensure 200,000 people could work from home. We hadn't imagined a situation like that. And I can tell you that our IT folks didn't sleep for weeks in the beginning as they ensured that they added remote tokens, VPNs, set up platforms and systems, and ensured that everyone could continue to work seamlessly. And I think the ability to do that and the foresight to plan a system that could grow to such scale, even when it hadn't planned ever that everyone will work at home at the same time, is really an incredible achievement and has required a lot. And I think the other thing that worked in our favor is that we had the experience of previous crises, and we knew how to plan in terms of management and leadership, what to do, what to expect, how to plan for it. But even within that, with a sigh of relief, I think we told ourselves, this is not a financial crisis. This is a world crisis, but it's not a financial crisis. And so if you look at it from a fintech perspective, things didn't go bad across the board for everyone. Are there some areas that didn't fare as well as others? Of course, there are some areas that had a very hard time, I would say. But there are many areas that did well during COVID as well, because suddenly they were at the forefront. If you look at it, and I don't know if, unfortunately, we cannot do a raise of hands here, but I wonder how many of you didn't at least consider buying stock in the market now. People that would not necessarily have done it before. The stock market was a hub of activity like never before, with people of all walks of life suddenly getting involved in it. So that part of financial services did very well in startups in capital markets or capital markets related areas. I think COVID was an accelerant for them. It really helped them out in what they were doing. If you look at investments in financial services across the globe in 2020, more than 1/3 of the money went to digital and contactless payment. No surprise, right? I mean, who wants to now start touching money that hundreds of other people touched, and who knows if someone with COVID touched it or not? So there was a big shift towards that. And is it something that's just trendy? I don't think so. I think that the world was shifting towards more digital payments anyway. And so it will be a nice nudge forward, but it's not something that is, a fashion this year, and next year we'll go back to something else. And here we invested in something that's no longer relevant. So I think it was a safe and logical bet for companies. And if we look at other spaces, so for instance, Citi is an investor in a company called Silverfort. And what Silverfort does is they do remote tokens, so they do, I'll say it more accurately, they do network-based multi-factor authentication, which is many big words, but basically what it means is that it knows who you are. And as an employee, when you log in from afar, it knows that it's you, and it knows that you're going into something you're supposed to do. So for instance, if I were to come to Poland and access my email from my phone, that's fine, they will let me through. But if suddenly I try and access Citi's payment hub from Poland, logically, we would have to assume that it's not me, that I'm not doing that, because there's no reason in the world for me to do that wherever I am in the world. And so it knows to learn your system, the company's system, and to understand each person's specific use cases. And based on that, it can protect us and ensure that everyone logs in appropriately. So a company like that did phenomenally well during a period of COVID, because as people suddenly said, hey, I need to give access remotely, doing it on the basis of the network, a one-click implementation is, of course, phenomenal. So those were just a few examples, but it wasn't true for everyone across the board. And I think one of the big effects that we've seen is that as startups tried to engage with large companies were slower to move, and we're seeing slippage of contracts that are moving from one quarter to the next, sometimes even moving 2 quarters along. And that's not surprising in the current times, and companies will tend to focus on what's most critical, and other things will tend to be pushed aside or delayed and postponed. Not to say they won't happen, just that it'll be slower to happen. And I think in that situation, we'll see a lot of additional challenges, as this is not set to end anytime soon. And in particular, we're seeing these changes occur, I would say, in companies that are reliant on markets that have been challenged themselves, such as, for instance, the SMB markets or the travel markets. If you're a startup and you're reliant on those markets, your situation is rougher than if you're selling to companies that have thrived during COVID. So what do we foresee for the future? Well, travel remains limited, and countries maintain ever-changing rules on what is allowed and is not allowed. I think what we're seeing is that there is a great opportunity that has happened because of COVID. Thomas Friedman said in 2005 that the world is flat. I think COVID just flattened it even further. It doesn't matter if you're in Israel or in Warsaw. if you want to work with someone in New York, as long as you're willing to work other hours, either flexible hours or longer hours, you're now as relevant as the guy sitting in New York because they're no longer a desk away from each other. I would add that in City Israel, we've used this current opportunity to say where we were investing in developing the local ecosystem and sitting and talking to companies one by one. Another thing that we've done is create a community. So if you go on Facebook and you look for Tech for Fin, you will find that there is a thriving community that discusses all matters related to the space, helps each other, looks to engage, and everyone's welcome to join it. And the purpose and the goal of it is for us to all learn from each other and grow our capabilities in that space. Another aspect that we've looked at is the sheer number of companies that have pivoted from one space to the next and have grown in their capabilities because of what they've seen in COVID. And I would say here, perhaps a little bit of care is required to not pivot to something that is too tightly connected to something that is currently needed, and as we improve in our current situation will no longer be relevant. So I will leave you with this thought. What great opportunities can you point to in a world that has shifted? What changes do you think are short-term? And you may think twice about focusing on them. And what do you think is here to stay? And you could do so much if you focused on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ornit.
Thank you very much, Ornit. We're actually completely out of time, so I'll ask you a very quick question, if you can give a very quick answer. It's a non-technical question. You said that when you were hired, you were not an expert in fintech. And would you advise companies in these technologies to sometimes look at, I don't know, someone who is not an expert, a novice in technology? In a nutshell, please.
So very, very briefly, I'm a big believer in bringing people from different walks of life to not have one-track mind thinking, to ensure that we look at things from many different perspectives. And when Citi did it, I was supported by so many bankers who knew everything there is to know about fintech that it wasn't an issue that I didn't know about it. I was saved by the fact that I knew to ask the right people for the right help. But I think I brought in a different perspective and a different way of looking at life. And I think it would very much recommend always having multidisciplined teams, because I think they are richer and better for their being multidisciplined.
Thank you.
I cannot agree more.
Yeah. And just last one, what kind of dog do you have, if I can ask?
I have a black Labrador that I brought in early March because I said I'm working from home. It's the right time to be able to take care of it. And it's been probably the smartest thing I did this year.
Black Labradors are wonderful.
I fully agree that COVID, made some good things for us,
Well, thank you
so much, Ornit.
Thank
you.
Thank you for joining us. All the best.